I really do appreciate the opportunity to talk to so many distinguished people from the local area. I see a lot of friends among you people, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Robert Ingram. I am the Chief Compliance Officer and Tax Advisor for AFI. I'm an attorney licensed to practice in the state of Tennessee. My main job is keeping everybody's nose clean here at AFI, but I do, on the side, help our clients with tax planning and tax preparation. And I dabble in some estate planning consultation too. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys about this timely subject since the statute was just recently passed. And I should give you guys a little information about how tax law works. So if tax law were the human body, what Congress passed is essentially just the skeleton inside of the body. So the IRS takes the skeleton and figures out how it's going to interpret the words that were written down by Congress and what they passed. And they're going to flesh out regulations. And they're going to come up with different scenarios that they provide as examples for those regulations. And then from all that language, they're going to come up with the tax forms that you guys are familiar with your tax returns every year. And it'll probably be around January or February before they produce tax forms that are based off of what this bill is. So this is just the beginning of this process, and I don't envy them at all in the work that they have to do putting together regulations and forms in order to comply with this federal law. But what we're going to give you this afternoon is just a general summary of what the federal statute is. But when it comes to specific scenarios in your situation, these particulars are going to take some time to work out and flesh out. So we're just going to lay a summary down for you today, and then this is a constant process. And sometimes it happens every year where they rework regulations. And it's interesting. So sometimes the IRS comes up with interpretations that are contrary to what everybody's thinking. So tax professionals, just for instance, with the Secure 2.0 Act that was passed during COVID, the Congress set up what's called a 10-year rule for beneficiary IRAs, where if you inherit an IRA, you're supposed to distribute all the funds within that account within 10 years. And everybody in the tax profession thought that people would have the option to wait till the 10th year to distribute all those funds out of the account. Well, here comes the IRS, and they have proposed regulations where you have to take a required minimum distribution out each year if the person who passed away was already taking those RMDs. So, and we're in a situation where you could litigate the issue, but it's really not worth it to pay for the attorneys in order to clarify and to show that the IRS is wrong. So we're kind of stuck where we are. So I just wanted you guys to have that in the background when we're going through these things. So the key takeaways for the big, beautiful bill, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, is that it took the reforms of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, and it made many of them permanent. And this was a big issue within the tax profession, that many of the provisions of the TCJA were going to sunset after this year. And so everybody was wondering, will Congress pass something? What is it going to look like from 2025 to 2026? Well, they answered, and they made a lot of those sunset provisions permanent. So the tax rates are going to stay the same from 2025 to 2026, and they're going to be adjusted for inflation. They also took the standard deductions where they were higher, where they didn't allow for exemptions, so that less people were scrounging around finding documents for itemized deductions. Those larger standard deductions are permanent and are going to be adjusted for inflation. They've also taken the provisions about pass-through entities and self-employment income, where people had what's called a qualified business income deduction of 20%. That was set to phase out in 2025, and that has been made permanent. Also, they have created bonus depreciation for businesses that they'll be able to expense, which had been phased out. Now, they've taken all of those sunset provisions and made them permanent, but then they added extra bells and whistles, which causes opportunities for tax planning. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the temporary Social Security tip and overtime deductions that will finish up in 2028. Permanent means that they won't stop at a future date. So with the TCJA in 2017, when they passed it, 2025 was the last date that we would have those tax rates and those higher standard deductions. And then it would revert back to whatever it was before then. So what they've done is they have extended those out forever. They don't stop unless Congress passes another bill. And so when I say permanent, I just mean that Congress doesn't have to act. And because things are so difficult in Congress in order to pass things, there's a lot of friction that allows whatever they pass to stay on the same course for a long period of time. So they also gave another bell and whistle with a temporary increase to SALT deductions. And for those clients that have income in Virginia and North Carolina, there'll be a benefit for that. They also created what's called a Trump account. And I believe that Peter's going to speak more about that in his part of the presentation. And there were changes to the child tax credit. It's increased $200. They increased the estate gift tax exemption. So where the estate tax is now at estates that are larger than $14 million, they've increased that to $15 million and $30 million for married filing jointly. And then they've also changed the charitable giving deduction. And we'll get into that later on. So these are the tax rates and the tax brackets. So essentially, this is what we have for 2025. And if they hadn't passed this bill, the tax rates would increase, if not 1%, at least 2% in some of the tax brackets. And so we're looking at the same in 2026 as what we have in 2025. And the brackets are going to be adjusted for inflation. So despite whatever happens in the marketplace for inflation, we're still going to have the same tax rates moving forward. The standard deduction, this is what it is for 2025. It's been increased from what it should be. And this is also going to be adjusted for inflation as well. So moving forward, the standard deduction is going to increase every year. So this is adding a little bit of sugar to the economy, and Peter will talk about that. This is a big deal for small businesses, family businesses, that most small and family businesses are what's called pass-through entities. Either they're partnerships, LLCs, S-corps, and those that are independent contractors. So this was dated to phase out this year. And now, like I said previously, it's permanent. So they've actually taken the phase in for this particular deduction and phase out and increased it too. So more people are going to be covered by it. And so essentially 20% of your business income is deductible. So you're getting 20% of that pass-through business income totally tax-free. And then they've added on top of that this bonus depreciation that they've made permanent as well. Again, this is adding sugar to the economy for small and family businesses. Now here, this is something new. On the campaign trail, the candidates made promises about making Social Security totally tax-free. So what we have, the mechanism for allowing that to happen is they're giving those that are taking Social Security income and giving them a $6,000 higher standard deduction. And so you saw the previous standard deduction for individuals, which is $15,000. This will add $6,000 to that $15,000. So $21,000 of standard deduction for those taking Social Security income. Because essentially most people are making $20-some thousand in Social Security income. And this is their equivalent of making Social Security income tax-free. Now, if you make more than $75,000 as an individual or more than $150,000 as married filing jointly, then you're not going to have that deduction. But for those making under those amounts, that deduction is there available to them. And in addition to the Social Security being tax-free, those making tip wages and who are working overtime, they can deduct up to $25,000 of those tip wages and overtime as an above-the-line deduction against their income. But of course, this phases out too at $150,000, $300,000. Now, what I previously said about IRS regulations and tax forms, that's where the rubber hits the road on this. I suspect that there's going to be a separate box on W-2 where they keep track of overtime hours, where they have a separate box for tips and wages that then is reported on your first page of the 1040, that they're going to add an extra box and they're going to make that line of things above the line that much longer. But we won't know until January, February rolls around after they have promulgated all their regulations and we see the new forms. I know some of you had sent messages early on asking about that, but we're in a wait and see pattern until those things come out. So if you were a child born 2025 through 2028, the day of your birth, you're going to get $1,000 from the federal government. And like I said, they're putting together regulations for this. We're not exactly sure how this is going to work. I don't know if the parents of the child go to a bank or financial institution that's in the law, qualified bank or financial institution, where you're supposed to take a birth certificate and Social Security number, and then the IRS pays the bank directly. We don't know if it comes in a refund with your 2025 tax return. We don't know how this looks at all. They're putting this together. And then for those that are already born, if you're under the age of 18, you can fund this account up to $5,000 every year if you're a family member. It also allows the ability for an employer to match up to $2,500 to be a part of that $5,000. The interesting thing about this is that it comes For the $5,000, these are post-tax dollars. They grow tax deferred until someone turns the age of 18. Then they're allowed to make distributions for educational expenses, college expenses, first-time home buyer, and to start up a business. But those distributions that come out, my understanding is that they're taxed at the ordinary tax rate of the child. So it's not like a 529 account where the whole distribution comes out, pays for educational expenses, and it's totally tax-free. So, but it just adds to the diversity of those accounts that are out there that people can choose depending on what your situation is. So in this environment, 529s, Roth IRAs, and UTMAs still play a role and are still viable. So here I'm just talking about the SALT deduction has been increased to $40,000 for those making under $500,000. So this is in place for 5 years, and then it reverts back to the $10,000. So they have created a sunset provision for those people from Virginia and North Carolina that don't receive the glorious benefits of the state of Tennessee. So the child tax credit has been increased, $200. It was $2,000 in 2024. That's made permanent, and it's adjusted for inflation. However, it's not a refundable tax credit. Now, the estate and gift tax, that's been increased, like I said, $15 million, where it's at, it was previously at $14 million and $30 million for married filing jointly, and it's indexed for inflation. So this will continually increase over time. And honestly, most tax professionals knew that Congress was going to pass something, because this involves a lot of family businesses and family farms, and something had to be passed. Otherwise, we would have reverted back to the $5 million number adjusted for inflation. So for charitable giving, Congress is now allowing those people who don't itemize on their tax return to take a deduction for their charitable giving. So for married filing jointly, you can take $2,000. For single filers, $1,000. So if you're not itemizing, you can take those things. But where they have given, they have kind of taken away on the other end. So you can only take a deduction for charitable giving that is above 0.5% of your income. Now they are allowing it for up to 60% of your adjusted gross income for cash contributions. They haven't changed anything for qualified charitable distributions from IRA and other retirement accounts. So if you've come to one of our previous lunch and learns and you've heard me talk, this is the greatest hits here. We continue to work within a low tax environment relatively. So realizing income sooner rather than later is more tax efficient in this environment. With the expectation this bill is likely to generate more debt for our country. So more money will need to be raised in the future. So now is better to take that income and be taxed on it now than later. So if you have capital gain assets, if you have family businesses that you're thinking about selling, now is the time to start structuring that because of the lower rates. Also, looking at retirement accounts. Because of the Social Security income deduction, we have 25, 26, 27, and 28 as lower taxable income to take advantage of Roth conversions. So people who are in that period of time where they're taking Social Security income, but they're not being forced to take their RMDs, now is the opportunity to do those conversions. And I know you guys have specific situations, and we can talk about those individually, but that's the environment where we're in. Healthcares and HSAs continually are a great place for investment because of the triple tax advantage, and this bill doesn't do anything to interfere with any of that. And like I said earlier, 529s, UTMAs, these accounts for children still make sense with Trump accounts. And now is the time to do your estate planning as well because of where the estate tax exemption is.
So kind of what I'm looking at is where Robert's looking at it from the tax angle. I'm really looking at, well, what does this bill do to the way money moves? And ultimately, the way money moves is the way the stock market and your investments adjust their pattern, because every time we see one of these tax bills or any other government bill that changes the benefits to one industry or another, it changes the landscape. And so that's really kind of what my portion is focused on. The biggest thing for me about this tax bill is we had a lunch and learn, 2 years ago, probably at this point, talking about, hey, these tax cuts are going to expire. We don't know what's going to happen. This gives us a lot of stability. And so predictable tax codes really allow businesses and investors to have better long-term planning and to commit to things. So removing the sunset on the corporate tax rate enables a business to say, okay, well, in 2027, we know what our tax rate is, in 28, 29. That makes them more likely to do capital expenditures, build a new plant, know where their financing is coming from, because they're not worried about where their increases in costs are going to be. So we do expect that alone, just clarity, to be a driving factor. It's not that dissimilar to when we have split government and everybody's like, well, they're not going to do anything because they can't agree, and one side controls the House and one controls the Senate, and nothing's going to happen, and the market takes off because they're like, they can't do anything. This is kind of the same thing, except we know what's going to happen, and we're not worried about the sunsetting of these provisions. And so to harken back a little bit to what you asked about on permanency, they could always change these. The next Congress could come in. But one of the reasons why you do typically see sunsets is when they go out and score the bill and say, well, how much is this going to cost us? If you sunset it, it costs less. If it goes into perpetuity, then you've got a different equation. So a lot of times that's why, especially with the 2017 tax code, that was a big part of it, of saying, okay, well, if it's going to cost this amount, how can we get it to cost less? Let's make sure that they sunset. And then now in extending it, we know the costs for going forward. This is kind of a top line look at what my first impressions are they're going to happen within the economy. So going kind of through the stock market sectors, probably, the ones in the green are communication services, staples, energies, financials, and industrials to varying degrees. The ones in the red, consumer discretionary, healthcare, information technology, materials, real estate, and utilities, all have various areas because of the way this bill is structured that I think have some headwinds. And one of the things I wanted to do is really kind of dive into that. The energy sector is a big beneficiary of this bill, primarily because of the rollbacks in the clean energy incentives. So that was one of the things that came out of the bill, that, all right, we're not going to incentivize this, which then apples to apples comparison makes the energy environment more, I guess, attractive for investors. The industrials, so think about like Caterpillar and the things that are building our country from an industrial standpoint and infrastructure, that immediate expensing is huge for them. So they'll green light projects that are now all of a sudden from an internal rate of return standpoint, positive a lot faster if they know they can immediately depreciate how much it's going to cost them. There's also some increased defense spending, that goes along with this bill. So your Lockheed Martins and Raytheons of the world, Northrop Grumman's, they're going to benefit from this bill. Financials, similar. Anytime we have businesses who are more certain about their environment, doing more capital expenditure, doing more loans, having more things come through, financials should benefit from this. They don't have necessarily a direct portion in this bill that says, hey, banks get this benefit, but the general environment will be better for financials. And we're in a low tax environment, as Robert said. We're also in a low interest rate environment. And so interest rates are at highs going back to 08, 09. But in general, we're still pretty low. Having the 10-year between 4 and 4.5, for the majority of the last couple of years, that makes it really cheap for businesses to move forward. We'll see if we get interest rate cuts. Chairman Powell talks tomorrow at Jackson Hole. That's a big talk. The Kansas City Fed governor came out actually today and was not very positive on rate cuts. He didn't think we were there. So that's always going to play in. But at 4%, 5%, and clarity, financials should do pretty well. Losers. Healthcare industry is really hit hard by this bill. And part of that has to do with where they had to raise the money to make these tax cuts permanent. And as Josh said, not in the political realm here, but the mechanics of how this bill had to get through. It had to be budget neutral to not need 60 votes in the Senate. So if you want to spend money, you have to cut money from somewhere. And the biggest cuts came in cuts to Medicaid and Medicare, sort of, there's definitely some things, but directly in Medicaid and in how Medicare is going to try and be able to be compensated. And so all of that's going to play in, but functionally, that huge withdrawal of federal funds is going to make it extremely hard, especially like in our area. Rural hospital systems are going to see a lot of stress over this. You've heard Alan Levine talk about that here recently. But they've got it. That's a really complex thing. It's not directly down to this, but this is not something that's helpful to their cause. So healthcare is going to struggle. Utilities are actually a unique one in that because of the clean energy credits that are coming off, they're going to struggle there because a lot of the credits that were involved, we've seen here recently talks again of like the TVA becoming privatized and things like that because they're not revenue positive and things. So anything in that area is hurting utilities. Utilities actually I say they're unique because they've been a massive beneficiary of the AI revolution because these AI companies need a ton of energy. So we've seen a weird thing, and people used to be bored to death by utilities. You buy Southern Company or American Electric Power, you get your 4, 5, 6% dividend. It never really moves in your portfolio and goes. Last couple of years, we've seen this massive capital appreciation there because of the AI companies. Real estate. This is an interesting one to me as well. As Robert said, we're going to have to raise revenue somewhere. And so that's going to play through the market in a lot of different ways. But if long-term rates end up staying higher, that's going to be detrimental to them. And there's also some stuff, and I've got another slide on it next, that with how foreign investors are able to play in our real estate markets, that it's going to make a pretty big difference on what they're allowed to do. And so, like I said, I really am focused on where's the money going to flow. Because to me, I'm agnostic. I don't care if I own Apple or if I own Home Depot. I want to own things that are moving positively with the flow of money. So this foreign investor tax issue, this is one of those things that's kind of tucked into the bill and you don't see it talked about a lot. But basically, if you're a foreign investor in the United States, you could go and set up a shell corporation that ends up running through Ireland, and you get your dividends or your real estate investment income back to you without paying foreign tax based upon the various rates that are industry specific. So it would not be uncommon to have like a 30% tax if you received dividends as a foreign investor on American stock, paying 30% right at the gate, that money from Schwab goes to the government. There's loopholes, like I said, with getting, these corporations set up to get around these treaties and tariffs on foreign investors. And so they've done a lot in this bill to close those. And just like we're seeing in the tariff debate, that's not a I do this and it's over type thing. There will be back and forth. Other countries will put in other things. But if it makes it less likely that if all of a sudden you're a real estate investor in Japan buying, something in California or wherever it would happen to be, and if all of a sudden you have to tack back on that 30% tax, that changes the flow of money. And so that's going to be a real interesting one there. And we'll have to see how that plays out. The defense and tech acceleration, those are where I think a lot of the money is going to come in. One, because of the expensing. And they're the two industries right now that are really doing a lot of capital expenditures. AI is the be all end all, right, of the stock market right now. So if all of a sudden I can put a new data center in and expense it out, they're going to do that. Certain things qualify for that immediate depreciation, and it just makes them cheaper. You're still having to spend the money, so you have to have the money, right? Or you have to have the access to debt. But if interest rates are low and we can immediately expense it, it's not that dissimilar. And I wish there was a good way to do this, but like, let's say for Aldebaran's sake, I bought a car. And then I could immediately expense the entire car and use it for personal use. I'm not allowed to do that directly. I own my own car. It's not owned by Aldebaran. But all of a sudden, instead of paying my wage, W-2 tax on the fund money that bought that car, I'm expensing it through the business for free. Not free, but I'm saving myself whatever my tax rate is. So it just makes those decisions easier. So that's going to be one of those things that I really do think within the defense and the AI sectors, you're going to see a lot from there. And then just with the extra spending that went into the defense sector, they're funneling a lot of their money into modernizing AI-driven things. Obviously we've seen huge amounts of spending like drones and, we've changed the style of warfare from, boots on the ground to being a very high-tech military. They're going to benefit from that. I think actually Robert did a really good job on talking about Trump accounts. This one I've got a little bit of the logistics that are interesting in it. One, if you're born between 25 and this year, kids qualify, but they don't have a mechanism yet to do this. So they're saying by January 1st, they'll have a mechanism to do this, to get that $1,000 from the government. We don't know exactly what that's going to be, but it has to be invested in U.S. equity indexes. And so similar to what we've seen in the 401k world and in retirement world, where employees are shoveling money into the 401ks, they're now automated, they're now immediately putting the money into the S&P 500, this will do the same thing. So functionally, you're basically saying the government is going to be shoveling money into the stock market at our birth rate for the next 5 years or wherever we sunset, 32 or 29, somewhere in there, 28. So
4 years.
4 years. Now, this could always get extended. The thought process that I've heard on these accounts is, especially like Roth IRAs where you can be income restricted out of them, that, won't exist here. There are a cap on how much can go into these. Lifetime, I think it's $50,000 is allowed to be contributed. And then there are going to be rules for how you can pull it out tax-free. It could be an opportunity, especially within the ability to gift. We're always talking about, hey, how do we get money into the next generation without paying taxes on it? This could be big, but we just don't have enough details on it. I like it from the idea of if they allow someone like us to manage that on behalf of a child, it gives us the opportunity to help educate, because obviously we've said 1,000 times, the earlier we start, the better. So if we can get kids in and be like, hey, why don't you go talk to Peter or Brian or Kaylee or Robert or whoever, and they got 1,000 when they were born, and all of a sudden they've got an account that's worth $10,000, instead of starting at zero when we're having that conversation, it's just a little bit more enticing. So I do think that that's going to be an interesting play, but we'll see where they go. I functionally think it's a way to boost the stock market, if I'm being honest. In theory, it would also take some of the stress off, if we're talking like 59 and a half years down the road, on the retirement system. So if we know that these Trump accounts, and this actually got floated not that long ago. Well, now it's long ago. I'm going to date myself. So if we remember the Bob Corker, Harold Ford Senate race here in Tennessee, one of Harold Ford's ideas was actually putting $1,000 in the kids' names when they were born. And with the idea that by the time they hit retirement age, it will have grown because it would grow better than Social Security would. And if we know that people are getting more money from these accounts, potentially maybe you see reductions in Social Security taxes. And the last time I looked, the average person puts in about $124,000 into Social Security during their working life. And then that's matched by the employer. So roughly, on average, people put in about $250,000. They get back out about $440,000 on average out of Social Security. That's not true, obviously, for everybody. There's people on the high end and the low end of that scale. But that, along with some of the other things, could be a big thing with where we're at. This is the kicker, and Robert kind of mentioned this. We're adding debt. Ultimately, we're adding debt. There's no way around that. The hope would be, anytime we add debt, would be that these spur the economy enough that gross domestic product increases and tax revenues come in based upon a higher amount. So if we go from earning $1 trillion to $2 trillion in the United States and we're taxed even at the same rate, there's more money to the government. That's the hope. It's government, right? It's lots of hopes. But if they add that amount of debt, it will put pressure on the ability for America to fund its debt. And regardless of what the Federal Reserve necessarily does, because they're fighting inflation and they're fighting, to keep people employed. Fundamentally, if people don't believe in the U.S. government, it's going to cost us more to have them borrow our money. And that's the risk. And so if we end up having that, then it increases pressure on, those areas. We'll have to be looking for, well, where do we have the ability to benefit from that? It might actually, from an investor standpoint, be a good thing because we get higher returns on our fixed income, but from a country standpoint, be a bad thing. So we're always trying to find that push and pull. And what we're really doing right now in evaluating this bill is looking at sector exposure, especially if we're overweight in certain areas. Looking at tax planning with Robert is huge. As he said, like if all of a sudden, let's say nothing for you changed in your tax picture and you get a $6,000 increase in your standard deduction. If we now take $6,000 out of your IRA and roll it into a Roth, we've already withheld, the way we were withholding before. So we're not going to need to put additional tax there. We've just functionally done a tax-free Roth conversion. So there's things like that are going to play in. We asked for questions to come in, and I'll start there, and we can move. But one of them specifically was actually two that came in talking about Roths and whether or not that still made sense underneath this bill. Roths are still going to be the be-all, end-all. They're the best version of the retirement account because of how they work, and still wanting more and more money to go into there. I don't think it dethrones the 401k, just because the 401k you can get so much more money into through your employer. If your employer offers a Roth 401k, even better. But everything that we can do early to lower our tax liability makes sense. Two of the questions that we had that came in, and then we'll completely open it up. Let's see here. That was there anything with student loans? There's been a lot of talk out there about like income-driven plans being reduced and things like that. The big, beautiful bill, nothing specific to student loans. There's been a lot of ancillary things that might go through, but nothing in this bill directly applied to that. So that's we're going to see more work on that out of Congress. We'll see, but nothing here specifically. If they do certain things, one would hope that they would do it in a way that doesn't really just bowl people over and they grandfather certain things in, but we'll see where that plays out. And then the last one, anything for new home buyers. One, I think the word new home buyers is really interesting because it doesn't mean it has to be your first time home buy. And the real estate agents in here know this, right? But it really is just like the last 3 years you can't have owned a home. So it could be your 7th home and you're still a first-time home buyer. And so a lot of these credits for first-time home buyers, people just ignore. They're like, I'm not a first-time home buyer, I won't even look at it. But the way they define it, and I've got this one, I think specifically on my phone, defines first-time home buyer as hasn't owned and lived in a primary residence in the past 3 years, or if it's been more than 3 years, you've only rented, you may qualify. Ownership of vacation homes, rental properties, inherited homes may not disqualify you. So there's a lot of things in there that
primary residence.
Yeah, it's just that primary resident rule is the big thing. So that being said, there's a new credit. There is a home buyer credit, but you have to be in a qualified housing opportunity zone. So basically somewhere where the government has determined we want housing. They've been either under, served in that market, or there's been some other thing that has caused people not to live there. They're trying to incentivize in a particular area. Not that dissimilar from saying, hey, if you go teach in this underprivileged school, we'll give you X amount off your student loan. It'd be the same type concept. And so it's a $10,000 first-time home buyer. It has to be in qualified home zone. They're expected basically to be in distressed areas. There will be some, you'd be surprised sometimes with what they consider an opportunity zone. So that's going to be something that you really have to watch for. I know that this is a, ever-changing thing. We appreciate you all coming. We'll keep putting stuff out. This will be on YouTube. Feel free to, share it or ask questions or follow up. We're here. It's anytime you have, the bill is 345 pages long, and it's written in government lawyer speak. That's, how it goes. So there may be things that change, and we'll, a lot of times the people who write these things think that they are clear as day on what they meant. It's kind of like my son writing his homework out, thinking he was clear as day what he was trying to do. And then the teacher's like, no, that doesn't count. So we'll see where it all goes.